Thank you for your patience as we had experienced some difficulties. My name is Lisa Field. I'm president of the Labor Guild. Thank you for joining us tonight for the Conversation Corner. We're here tonight with two great friends from the Mass AFL-CIO, Lindsay, Kenney, and Brian Dunn. And we're going to discuss tonight why politics matters. So we thought we'd start tonight if you could each just give a little bit of a biography about yourself, as well as what your role is at the Mass AFL-CIO. So Lindsay, we'll start with you.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Lindsay. Lisa, sorry. Or Lindsay. I'm Lindsay Kenney. I'm the legislative director for the Mass AFL-CIO. That functionally means is I'm in charge of ensuring that our legislative priorities are moving forward in the legislature, and also keeping my eye out for any policies moving through the legislature that might be really harmful to working people or the labor movement writ large. I came to the Mass AFL-CIO in 2020 after previously working for the Mass Democratic Party and on the campaigns of several of our labor friends. Most prominently, Senator Paul Feeney, IBEW 2222 member.
Woohoo! That's where we know each other from. Brian, your turn.
Thanks, Lisa. My name is Brian Dunn. I'm the political director at the Massachusetts AFL-CIO. So I'm basically in charge of running and overseeing our political program, which goes for state legislative races, statewide races, and congressional races, but I think we'll get into this later. Does not include municipal or county races, which are under a different jurisdiction. I started at the AFL in 2018, and before that worked on a bunch of campaigns, including Senator Elizabeth Warren's first campaign, and I worked in the Senate for Senator Dan Wolf and Senate President Therese Murray.
That's where I know you're from too. Look at that. It's old home week here. So let's get down to it. I'm going to ask the question and then either of you can take it. So let's take a step back. What is the Mass AFL-CIO? If you can explain what it is and then how does it work? What's the Central Labor Councils? What's the relationship with the National?
Great question. So the Massachusetts AFL-CIO is comprised of almost 500,000 union members from over 500 different local unions. We have a board of about 75 union leaders that sets our priorities, both politically and legislatively. And then we also have 7 central labor councils in Massachusetts and 1 area labor federation that's made up of 3 local labor assemblies in Western Mass that was just formed within the last 6 or so years. So those get down to the local level, but we like to think of ourselves as the voice of working people, those who are in unions and those who are not yet organized into unions. So we like to think of ourselves as representing everyone, not just those who are members.
And so, Brian, I'll start with you. Why should politics matter? So if I'm a rank and file union member, what does politics, why should I care about politics?
I think you can go back to the old phrase that if you don't have a seat at the table, then you're probably on the menu. And I think that sums it up pretty well here. I think if you look at your the companies you work for, your bosses, your insurance companies, everything else, they're all politically active. And there's a reason for that. We have a ton of working people here in Massachusetts that need a voice, and standing up for yourself and joining a bunch of other people to do so, and make sure that we pass legislation that protects workers, that protects workers' benefits, that allows people to live and retire with dignity, I think is why we all are in this. And I think that's why people go to work every day, is to be able to support their families and to be able to retire at some point and enjoy their retirement without having to worry about how they're going to still survive, how they're going to eat. And I think that getting involved in politics for unions and union members is essential to make sure. I think if you zoom out and go back to the presidential, you look at appointments that are made, and it's whoever's elected is appointing judges that are going to rule on a lot of cases that involve our unions. They're going to appoint people to the National Labor Relations Board that's going to determine whether certain bargaining units are allowed to form a union, what's going on around union elections, and what rules are to be followed. And that all goes back to elections. So I think people a lot of the times look at policy, but it's also people. It's who gets appointed to these things. And you look at, I think in Massachusetts, you can see the difference between when we had Charlie Baker in office versus now that we have Maura Healey in office. And there's a lot of boards that have sat idly for many years now that are finally being filled because Governor Healey is there. You look at the new state contracts that everyone got under Governor Healey with the raises. It's just, it's a pretty stark contrast when you look at what we had before versus what we have now. And that's just one elected office that we're looking at. So I think it's very important that everyone gets as involved as possible.
Great, thanks. My next question has to do with the endorsement process. So you said the state Fed of the Mass AFL-CIO gets involved in on the state side, right? The state level as well as the federal. If you could just kind of explain, how does the endorsement process work? So if I'm a candidate, let's play on the other side. I'm a candidate and I'm interested. Like, what's the process and how do you get there?
So there are a bunch of different processes depending on what position you are. So if you're a person running for an open seat, we send out questionnaires to every candidate for every open seat. And then when we get back the questionnaires, they meet with their local labor councils that we talked about earlier, or the local labor assemblies, if they're in the ALF region. And those local boards interview them, and those local labor councils make recommendations to the Massachusetts AFL-CIO's board, which is about 75 different union leaders from different sectors and around Massachusetts. And then in order to get the AFL-CIO's endorsement, you have to get 2/3 of the vice presidents to support your candidacy and get that endorsement. And that's for state legislative, constitutional offices, and the federal offices.
Great.
If you are an incumbent, we send out towards the end of the legislative session, we send out a letter telling them how to contact us to request the endorsement. We do it after the session ends on July 31st so that we can compile the labor voting records for everyone, how they voted on legislation that affects working people, and making sure that that they've voted with working people in Massachusetts before they get that endorsement.
And if it's county or local, they would have to a candidate would have to contact the local central labor council or the federation.
Correct. So every municipal election and county election is under the jurisdiction of the local labor councils and labor assemblies. So they make the direct endorsement there. They have a similar relationship that we have to the National AFL-CIO. They're chartered by the National AFL-CIO the same way the Massachusetts AFL-CIO is. So their jurisdiction is separate from ours in those races, but they do make the recommendations to us for the legislative races as well.
Got it. So you talk about a questionnaire that goes out to the candidates. What type of questions are in the questionnaire?
There's definitely over 50 questions on the questionnaire, and that's like we talked about earlier, because of how many local unions we have and how many different priorities there are at the Massachusetts AFL-CIO. And you try to compile the priorities of organizations that represent 500,000 people, there's obviously a lot of things on the list. So it goes from workplace safety to stopping wage theft to preventing misclassification of workers to anything that you can imagine. Benefits. One of the things that we like to do is fight for people to retain and improve their benefits. And one of the legislative victories we had this session was with benefits on day one for state employees, which was great. But it's a range of all those questions, from the ability of different groups to organize unions to, and anything you can imagine between when you're going from service employees to teachers to nurses to construction workers to everything in between. There's a ton of different legislation out there and different that we want to ask questions about. And that legislation, so the questions are mainly around legislation that has been filed in the past or that we would like to see filed, or things that we want to make sure do not get filed or pass.
And so if a candidate fills out the questionnaire, then they're brought in for an interview?
Correct. So then they, when they send back the questionnaires to the AFL-CIO, we send out that questionnaire to the local central labor body. And that central labor body will reach out to the candidate to schedule an interview. We'll also include the contact information for that local CLC or assembly or ALF president to that candidate, so that they can also get in touch the other way with that person as well. And then once they go in and meet with the local labor bodies, they make the recommendation to the AFL-CIO board.
And so does the AFL-CIO state board, do you only endorse Democrats, or do you also endorse Republicans? Is it just, do you base your endorsements solely on like where do candidates stand on labor issues? Kind of like what, a little bit, I want to know a little bit more about that process.
So we don't just endorse Democrats, although we mainly endorse Democrats. And I think it's kind of obvious why, if you look at nationally who's supporting working people and who's supporting the right to organize and that kind of stuff. But we have endorsed Republicans in the past, and I'm sure we will again. A good example, I think, would be Pat O'Connor down in Weymouth, who we've endorsed many times and who has a very good labor voting record and co-sponsors and sponsors a lot of our legislation. So we'll endorse any person regardless of party if they're standing with working people. It's not a partisan issue, although it appears that way in many instances, but there are some good Republicans that do stand on our issues. And then I think you asked the second part of that question that I forget now.
I forgot too. I'm just reviewing my little thing here. So that's interesting. So talk to me about how many labor, we always hear within the labor movement that there's an encouragement to have labor members, union members run for office. Kind of how many members are in the current state legislature? I know I'm putting you on the spot here. How many union members do we have up there? A ballpark?
I'd say about a dozen.
Mm-hmm.
If I were to take a guess, and they're from pretty diverse sectors as well. We have some IBEW, we have some UAW, we have some teachers. We have a bunch of different unions represented up there, which is great. And obviously we are always encouraging union members to run for office. So if you're a union member watching this, think about running for office someday, because the more of our members that we have up there, we know that our voices will be heard, and we know that those people have lived a lot of the same life experiences that we have, and that will allow them to support us better and support working people better while they're up there.
And really, who better to come up with some of this policy than the people who actually do the work, right?
Exactly.
Yep, exactly. So I'm going to switch over to Lindsay, lest you think I forgot you. So let's talk about the legislation. So we have people are now elected. I know we're at the end of the session now. So, but for next session, people are elected. The AFL-CIO, the new session starts. The AFL-CIO looks at legislation to file. Let's start with the basic question. Why does the Mass AFL-CIO file legislation?
So it's kind of a two-pronged answer. The first is that ultimately policy is one of the strongest things that we can have to protect and grow the labor movement. And it's important that as the quote unquote union of unions, we're involved in that process. But on the other hand, we file a relatively small number of bills compared to pretty much every other labor group in this state. And that's because we typically file legislation that applies broadly across a number of sectors and industries. So those policies that often don't seem to make sense for one union to do over another, we end up being the group that kind of houses a lot of that work and coordinates that work. Ultimately, like policy, as I mentioned, is a really big deal for labor movements. It's how we have the prevailing wage for the construction industry, also known as a union wage in other states. It's how we got the school funding formula fixed, which is huge for our public sector teachers and for our students and communities. It's how we got the minimum wage increased a few years ago. It's how we got the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights, driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants. Like all of these things, while they might impact like larger community and larger kind of swaths of Massachusetts residents, are all at their like core a work issue, a workplace issue that get done in the legislature. And we have quite a bit more power to control what happens in Massachusetts than we do what happens nationally. We can't always rely on Washington to do what we need it to do. So that's why it's important that we're active in doing that in Massachusetts.
Great. And so how do you determine which issues? You did say these are the issues that are more broad-based. Is there anything else that goes into that? Do you have, is this part of, does the staff kind of talk to the unions to find out what the issues are? And then the vice presidents of the state board, Fed board, are they the ones that vote? Yes, see, these are the ones we're going to file.
Yeah, so there's, again, kind of a two-pronged answer. So the first, so for the legislation that we file, it falls into two camps. Policies we've been fighting for over a decade. Shout out Wage Theft Coalition. We're really trying to get that fixed, as Brian knows intimately. But and then also kind of new emerging issues that labor needs to have a hold on, such as regulating app-based companies and app-based work, and regulating labor standards for clean energy projects. In terms of all of the other legislation we work on, we typically endorse over 150 pieces of legislation each session. Usually it's closer to 200. We only endorse, unless it's something we have filed as an organization. Actually, I should specify, unless it's legislation we have asked our partners in the legislature to sponsor and file for us, we only endorse bills that have been brought to us by affiliate unions. So they're brought to the executive board. The executive board is asked to evaluate the legislation and choose whether or not to endorse it. It's a kind of a similar project to our partisan, not partisan, electoral endorsements, because it involves in place of a candidate statement or a statement of recommendation from the CLCs, that comes from the affiliate union that wants to push that policy forward. And then we take a vote, and then it immediately becomes a bill that we're working on. That vote typically happens in February or March of the first year of the 2-year legislative cycle. So we'll have that next March. We had it in March 2023. And this is, I think, one of those moments where you get to see solidarity in action. There are a lot of bills that move in across kind of our desk, our table, that one union has like no real reason to care about beyond the fact that they have solidarity with another union sitting at that table and with that union's members, and knowing that like we all row this boat together and have to push it forward together, even if it's not always our goal in mind or our paycheck in mind. And so we cover the gamut from incredibly technical changes that are just changing in the law what IRS form is being recognized, or massive sweeping changes such as rewriting how wage theft is handled by the Attorney General's office. So we kind of do it all, but it is a combination of acknowledging what are the big issues of the day that we need to address, and also what are the needs and wants of our affiliate unions.
Great, thanks. So we're now in the second year of the session, the legislative session, 2-year session, and the clock is ticking, right? So when does the session end?
July 31st.
Yep, the formal session ends, yep. So if you can just pick a couple, you talked about wage theft. I want to talk a little bit more about what are the priorities that the Mass AFL-CIO is trying to get over the hurdle. And for our viewers, if you're not very familiar with the legislative process, there's thousands of bills that are filed each legislative session. So it's a real hurdle to get them across the finish line, so to speak. So let's talk about wage theft a little bit. So what is wage theft? And I'll open it up to Brian as well. So.
I'd actually, Brian is our resident kind of wage theft czar, I'll say. He handles the Stop Wage Theft Coalition for our office. So I definitely kick it to Brian to handle that.
I mean, wage theft is any time that you're not paid what you're owed. So a lot of the times, people will misclassify workers as a different position on a prevailing wage job. They won't pay overtime. They won't provide sick time. They won't provide vacation time. They'll say they're going to pay people one rate and then they'll pay them less. They won't pay them for time between, going to pick up equipment, picking up that equipment to bring it to a job site. And then they will say, okay, you can start when you get to the job site. But in reality, they've already gone to somewhere. They've been working for an hour plus, packing the truck, getting all the materials and tools onto the truck to go to a job site. And then they don't get paid for that time. So there's a bunch of different ways.
And so why should people care about wage theft?
I mean, in Massachusetts alone, there's over $1 billion a year stolen from workers by unscrupulous employers. So I think if you just think about that number and think about how many people there are in this state, and it doesn't just affect the people who are being taken advantage of a lot of the times, which are low-income workers, workers of color, people who are undocumented and don't have as many protections as other people. It's also $100 million worth of lost tax revenue to the state that goes back into programs, and it's lost work for the good companies who are playing by the rules, who are then going into a job site or going into a job and being underbid by someone who's misclassifying their workers. So then it's basically rewarding the bad behavior by allowing these people to bid less on jobs. And then they're getting those jobs, and the people that are following the rules aren't getting those jobs because of it. And the biggest issue we have with it now, and what our bill looks to rectify, is that if you're a lead contractor, you hire a bunch of different levels of subcontractor. And right now, the only person who's responsible to you is your direct employer if you're an employee. So they can have, you have general contractors out there that could be hiring these subcontractors that they know are going to come in lower so that they can bid the whole project lower. But the only person that the employee is able to go after is their own employer, when they should be able to go up the food chain to vicarious liability to the lead contractor and the ones below that. So you can say, stop hiring this company if you can't trust them to do it. If you're a general contractor on I keep talking about construction here, I feel like, because it's the easiest example. But if you're a general contractor, you're already responsible for the safety, you're responsible for the timeline, the completion of the project. So it only makes sense that you would also be responsible to make sure that every person on that job site was paid what they're owed, since it's your job overall. And that's what we're asking to do with our wage theft legislation.
And how long have you been fighting for this bill to pass the finish line?
Over 10 years now. And we routinely have 120 plus co-sponsors between the House and the Senate. This bill was passed unanimously by the Senate a few sessions ago. It was reported favorably out of committee and then died in House Ways and Means last legislative session. This legislative session, it's been extended, but it has not been reported out of committee yet. So I mean, there is broad support for this legislation amongst legislators. It's a matter of getting it to the floor to get it passed.
So I'm going to ask a little question for folks who are, again, are not so involved within the political process. So if a bill gets out of the committee, so when a bill's filed and it goes to whatever committee it's assigned to, and it gets reported out favorably and ends up, sometimes it goes along. I'm from the Nurses Association, so, you know, our stuff lands in public health, but ultimately it ends up in healthcare finance, because that had anything to do with money ends up there. And then it moves on to Ways and Means. And then that's where a lot of times things get stuck, right? Or, so again, did I get that right? Is that how it works?
Yeah, so what you described, for instance, with healthcare legislation is basically sometimes bills are deemed to have dual subject matter, so they fit in multiple committees. Sometimes between the House and the Senate, they'll agree it can just go to the one committee and they'll make a full evaluation of the bill. Other times they'll say, well, it really should go to this other committee because it's such a big issue or deals with so many moving parts. A big part of the reason why all healthcare bills have to go through typically public health and healthcare financing is because public health regulation happens at the state, but a lot of public health financing happens federally. So they need to make sure it's kind of covered in both places. And then it moves to Ways and Means, which are like the accountants of the legislature. They make sure all of the rules in terms of what the legislature can do are being followed. They make sure that the bills don't conflict with other legislation that might be passed. And they do fiscal analysis of the bill to see what it would realistically cost to either implement on just an administrative level. If you pass a new rule, like that costs money, even if you don't, even if it's not hiring any new people or anything like that. But then massive bills that involve huge new kind of systems can cost a lot more money, and it's their responsibility to do it there. And speaking candidly, if a bill gets reported out favorably, but the legislature doesn't actually want to deal with it, they'll just let it wallow in House Ways and Means to say that they did something. It did receive a favorable vote. And that's kind of where you see in our legislature power really centralized in those Ways and Means committees and then leadership in either branch. And so it's really important that when we do our legislative advocacy, we don't just focus on the 20 people that might be on one committee. It's important that we focus on the entire building, because it is a much broader process than the individual steps make it seem.
So if it gets to Ways and Means, because sometimes we get all excited, right? Oh yeah, it passed committee and now it's in Ways and Means. So if it gets out of Ways and Means, then what happens? It's like watching sausage being made. That's how we always kind of refer to it.
Yes, how the bill becomes a law, Massachusetts edition. So once a bill is left Ways and Means, Ways and Means will not move on a bill unless it's going to be moving to the floor for a vote. It'll happen either in the Senate or the House. It doesn't. The only time the order matters is for budget bills. It has to go to the House first. But it'll go to the floor of the House for a vote. If the House passes it, it then goes to Senate Ways and Means. The Senate Ways and Means can kind of make their own draft of the bill, or not. They could just take the House version for what it is. And then that would move to the Senate for a vote. Once the Senate has voted on it, if the House version and the Senate version don't match up, it then moves to another committee called, oh my gosh, I cannot, it's a CC.
Conference.
Thank you. It's a conference committee where basically 3 members of each branch have to get together and determine what is going to be the final version of the bill. And then that final version of the bill has to go back to the House and Senate for votes. And then it goes to the governor for a vote, and you have to hope and pray she doesn't veto it, because then they kind of have to start part of this process all over again.
Mm-hmm. And that is why sometimes people who are members who are constituents will get a call from the union saying, you need to call your state rep because that state rep or that state senator might sit on that conference committee.
Mhm.
You know, again, it's like making sausage, right? So if you're not in the kind of in the loop of it, it gets, what am I doing? You know, I thought this passed. No, passed committee, or it passed over here, but we still have a way to get it over the hurdle. Yeah. Yeah. Besides wage theft, what would you say is another big one that you're trying to get over the hurdle?
I'd say right now, and this is actually new for us this session, is climate jobs. So we have formed a 501c3 called Climate Jobs Massachusetts, which has the goal and mission of ensuring that Massachusetts' transition to clean energy does not leave out workers. So we've already seen actually one of the biggest construction industries in Massachusetts responsible for wage theft is the solar industry. They are a very non-union, very anti-union industry. But as the climate crisis continues, and as Massachusetts makes kind of these grand efforts to make us less reliable on fossil fuels, things like solar panels and wind turbines and certain kinds of hydrogen power are going to become a lot more common. And so it's really important that those jobs, that new infrastructure that we're building, center workers. So that is labor standards, such as the prevailing wage. That is strong worker protections, so that they have the same knowledge that they can report in an unsafe situation or can't get fired for no reason on the job site. We're highly encouraging the use of project labor agreements as well, which ensure that when a project is done union, the entire project is done union, which is a huge boon to local municipalities. And it also ensures that those projects meet certain really like diversity guidelines that ensure that there are diverse hiring practices. There's local hire, so that a project in a community is really going back into the community. And then there are some also, you know, using those kinds of projects open us up to a lot more federal funding opportunities. The other side of that, though, is and additionally ensuring that those climate projects bear in mind environmental justice communities. So environmental justice communities, I know that's another kind of phrase that folks might not be familiar with, but those are communities that are typically lower income. They might be predominantly an immigrant neighborhood. They might be predominantly a neighborhood of Black or Brown residents that are often not accounted for in the larger kind of environmental protection movement. These tend to be communities that exist next to highways, on coastlines, near sewage facilities, et cetera. And so ensuring that those voices and those people are also centered in the climate conversation. So that's where we move forward to combat climate change. But we also have to acknowledge the reality that combating climate change and moving away from fossil fuels means that the tens of thousands of workers in Massachusetts who work in gas projects will eventually be put out of a job. We are in a weird spot in the labor movement where we are ultimately kind of pushing for policies that mean our workers will be out of work, because we know that it is ultimately better for us in Massachusetts, us in the US, and us globally. But we have to acknowledge that there are really real fears those workers have and really real consequences to this push towards clean energy. And so part of what we're advocating for is something called a just transition, which basically ensures that workers who work in fossil fuel infrastructure now have kind of first opportunities at retraining, entry into new apprenticeship programs, if that's what they wish to do, or even just protection in retirement if they need to go out early. It also ensures that those workers are kind of treated like another mass layoff situation, because even though it's going to happen more as a trickle, it is ultimately a part of a larger issue. And And I think I definitely have to echo our president, Chrissy Lynch's words when it comes to climate change, which has been a really contentious issue in the labor movement in the past 15, 20 years, because there's been a real reckoning with what it means to be experiencing the decline of an industry when you are charged with protecting the workers in that industry. And we've often been faced with environmentalists outside of the labor movement who don't understand that reality and don't understand why we need to take a cautious approach. But we are finally at this point where we have labor and environmental groups together at the table, creating policy together. And that actually all three bills we have related to climate policy have been reported out favorably to House Ways and Means. I'd say that's probably, if I, again, can speak for President Lynch, our number one thing that we're working on and excited about. And then Brian mentioned that we have benefits on day one, which is health insurance benefits for any worker enrolled in the Group Insurance Commission on their first day of employment. So those are state and some municipal employees, which is really awesome. And I think like the final thing is the fight against Uber and Lyft and big tech companies who have business models based in exploiting workers and misclassifying them so that they don't have to pay those workers a fair wage, pay them health insurance, sick time, provide workers' compensation, pay into UI, Social Security, just general sales taxes, anything. So we're really pushing to increase regulations for these companies at the same time that we're promoting and protecting workers that do rideshare and delivery so that they can form their own unions. I know that's a lot. We have again,
So
the
much,
legislation
right?
is too big.
Yeah. Making the sausage. So if people wanted to find out more information about this, where would they go? So if they go to what's your website? We'll have Andrew put it in the chat on the Facebook Live.
So it's massaflcio.org. Mass is MASS. And we have a banner up there that has both our political program laid out and also our legislative program.
Terrific. And you have ways if people wanted to get involved, is there some actions that they can take? And folks should always check with their individual unions as well, because I'm sure they all have their own political agenda as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. I believe you can sign up for our newsletter there, where as things move, we really push stuff out. But we also have kind of a general kind of get involved link where folks can see how to best get involved, which I believe also includes if they're not involved in their local labor council, how they can get involved there.
Great. Would love, I sit on a couple of them, would love to see folks. Always
Same.
great. Yeah, always great.
I'm usually with you.
Yeah. Brian and I go from one to the other. So let me ask Andrew, does anybody have any questions in the chat? So viewers, if you have any questions, put them right in the Facebook chat and we can ask Brian and Lindsay. Let's see. Oh, nope, nothing yet. Anything else we didn't talk about that you'd like to cover?
I don't think so. I'd like to reiterate that people should get involved, especially with your local union and with your local labor council. I know Lindsay sits on a few of them, and Lisa, I know you and I sit on the same ones.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always great to see new people. In Southeastern Mass, we have had a lot of new people come in the last year, and it's always great to get perspective of different unions and different bargaining units within those unions, so that we can lift up people's priorities and help people in their struggles to get dignity on the job.
So it's interesting, there's more that unites us than divides us, because I think sometimes people are thinking, well, I don't understand that. Like if you're not in the construction trades, understand what is a project labor agreement and how does that matter? Same with wage theft, but those issues affect all of us one way or the other. I mean, we all want good jobs within our communities. We want people to be paid the wage that they're supposed to be paid, be classified the job they're supposed to be.
And I think that's like a big thing that we want to say about our like program at the Massachusetts AFL-CIO is that like you look at it and there's like, 12 of us on staff or whatever there is, but what we're pushing is the priorities of everyone. And for this legislation to be endorsed, I think Lindsay, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. I'm pretty sure that every piece of legislation, all 150 plus bills that we endorsed this past session were unanimous. So this is like bringing together, people that represent 500,000 workers that are saying, okay, this is all stuff that we support. So it's not like, we're not pushing stuff for each union. If someone else was opposed to it, like this is all unanimous amongst all of these unions.
Great show of solidarity. We do have a question from a viewer. Is there any current legislation concerning temp agencies who are known for wage theft with immigrant workers?
So I think what's great is our wage theft bill actually would cover this kind of wage theft. So Brian used the construction example earlier, but when we say lead contractor, we basically mean any company that hires out to another company for work. So in the case of temp agencies, that if you work in an accountant's office and they are hiring a temp to come and do office work, that temp agency becomes the subcontractor. And so anyone who works for them, who gets hired through that agency, would be someone who we're looking at to protect from wage theft. In addition, our wage theft coalition includes a lot of worker centers who have predominantly immigrant kind of populations that they work with. So they've been heavily involved in our kind of legislative process, not just in the advocacy on the bill, but actually crafting the policies in the bill. And then the third part of that is our bill includes enhanced enforcement measures for the Attorney General's office. So the Attorney General's Wage Enforcement Division has a really limited kind of frankly funding and ability to tackle wage theft. They can only recover about 1% of wage theft each year. And that's because their budget is like just over $500,000 a year, and that's combating $1 billion in wage theft. So this would increase funding for that division and the ability for the Attorney General to take action on behalf of workers, even when they are not necessarily aware that they have had their wages stolen from them, which unfortunately the Attorney General currently can't do, which is speaking specifically for immigrant workers who might not speak English, who might not have all of the information that they should have from their employer, an incredibly important power for the AG's office to have.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. Any other questions? I don't see any more in the chat. Final thoughts. I'll start with you, Brian.
I just want to say thank you for having us on. Thank you to everyone that's watching, and one more plug to get involved in politics, especially if you're a union member.
And you, Lindsay, one more plug. We like to plug.
Yeah, I just echo Brian. Thank you so much for having us and letting us talk about, I think, one of our many nerdy passions. And I'd also, my little plug for everyone who's going to vote in a few months is to fill out your ballot backwards, especially in a presidential election year, because it's the last thing on the ballot is going to have the most impact on your life.
All politics are local. Who said that? Tip O'Neill, right? Well, politics are local. Yeah, yeah. Well, I want to thank you both so much. The Massachusetts AFL-CIO is such a great partner to the Labor Guild. Thank you all for viewing this and watching it. If you want more information about the Labor Guild, you can check out more information about us on our website, laborguild.com. We have some classes starting next week, so check them out. Check out our YouTube. We have a lot of cool stuff that's happening. So again, thank you both so much. We really appreciate you coming on. I learned a lot today.